Slide 1. Welcome to Chapter 3. Tonight we'll be talking about biological psychology. This is going to be kind of short because I figure if you're taking any other classes that touch on biology, they've already gone over this stuff, so this will act as a review. Also, I'm assuming you will have to take or already have taken a Bio 101 course that will go into much more detail on this topic. So this is just like a bumper sticker version of the most basic biology you need to know to make sense of the rest of the semester. Let's get on with the show. Slide 2. Because psychology flows downstream from having a nervous system, which includes our brain, we will be focusing on the biology of the brain and the nervous system. This is called neurobiology. The prefix neuro lets you know it relates to the nervous system, so we'll be seeing a lot of that. This lecture will be broken up into 3 sections. First, we'll discuss the building blocks of the nervous system, the neurons. Then we'll look at the overall structure of the nervous system. And finally, we'll address some larger topics as they apply to the biology of humans. Slide 3. When we think of the brain, we likely think of the walnut-shaped, hopefully not walnut-sized, object inside our head. That head walnut is made up of an enormous number of separate cells called neurons. There are an estimated 12 to 15 billion neurons in the outer shell of the brain called the cerebral cortex and its associated areas, 70 billion neurons in the cerebellum at the base of the brain, and 1 billion neurons in the spinal cord. The nervous system also contains other kinds of cells called glia that support the neurons in many ways, such as by insulating them, synchronizing activity among neighboring neurons, and removing waste products. The glia are smaller but more numerous than neurons. Neurons are similar to other body cells in most ways. The most distinctive feature of neurons is their shape, which varies depending on whether they receive information from a few sources or many, and whether they send impulses over a short or long distance. A neuron consists of 3 parts: a cell body, dendrites, and an axon. The cell body contains the nucleus of the cell. Slide 4. The dendrites, from a Greek word meaning tree, are widely branching structures that receive input from other neurons. The axon is a single, long, thin, straight fiber with branches near its tip. Some vertebrate axons are covered with myelin, an insulating sheath that speeds up the transmission of impulses along an axon. As a rule, an axon transmits information to other cells, and the dendrites or cell body receives that information. Slide 5. The function of an axon is to convey information over long distances, such as from the skin to the spinal cord, or from the spinal cord to a muscle. Axons convey information by a process called an action potential, an excitation that travels along an axon at a constant strength, no matter how far it travels. An action is a yes, no, or on-off message, like flicking a light switch without a dimmer. That is, it will remain off until the electrochemical activity reaches and passes the threshold, which will then turn it on to send an action along the axon. Slide 6. All right, slide number 7. A typical axon has branches, each ending with a little bulge called a presynaptic ending, or terminal button, as shown in figure 3.7. When an action potential reaches the terminal button, it releases a neurotransmitter. We'll get into those in just a bit. Slide 8. A neuron communicates with other neurons by releasing a chemical called a neurotransmitter at a specialized junction called a synapse. The neurotransmitter molecules diffuse across a narrow gap to receptors on the postsynaptic neuron, the neuron on the receiving end of the synapse. A neurotransmitter can either excite or inhibit the postsynaptic neuron with varying durations of effect. After a neurotransmitter excites or inhibits a receptor, it separates from the receptor, ending the message. From that point on, the fate of the receptor molecule varies. It could bounce back to re-excite the postsynaptic receptor, it could diffuse away from the synapse, or it could be reabsorbed by the axon that released it through a process called reuptake. Slide 9. The brain has dozens of neurotransmitters, some of them listed in Table 3.1, each of which activates many types of receptors. An excess or deficit of a particular neurotransmitter can lead to abnormal behavior, such as that exhibited by people with Parkinson's disease, a condition that affects 1 to 2% of people over the age of 65. The main symptoms are difficulty in initiating voluntary movement, slow movement, tremors, rigidity, and depressed mood. Slide 10. Slide 11. Table 3.2 summarizes the effects of several drugs. Stimulant drugs, such as amphetamines and cocaine, increase activity levels and pleasure by increasing the release and decreasing the reuptake of dopamine and certain other neurotransmitters. Dopamine synapses are critical for almost anything that strongly motivates people, ranging from sex and food to music, gambling, and video games. The behavioral effects of stimulant drugs depends on the dose. Low levels enhance attention. At higher doses, amphetamine and cocaine lead to confusion, impaired attention, and impulsiveness. Physical effects include higher heart rate, blood pressure, and body temperature, and a risk of convulsions, lung damage, and heart attack. As amphetamine or cocaine enters the brain, it increases arousal and produces mostly pleasant effects. However, because these drugs are inhibiting the reuptake of dopamine and other neurotransmitters, the transmitters wash away from the synapses faster than the presynaptic neurons can replace them. Over the next few hours, the presynaptic neuron's supply of transmitters dwindles, and users begin to experience mild lethargy and depression that last until the neurons rebuild their supply. Methylphenidate, or Ritalin, works the same way as cocaine at the same synapses. The difference is that methylphenidate reaches the brain gradually over an hour or more and declines slowly over hours. Therefore, it does not produce the sudden rush that makes cocaine so addictive. Slide 12. Depressants are drugs that decrease arousal. Alcohol, the most widely abused drug in our society, relaxes people and relieves their inhibitions. It can also impair judgment and reasoning. Alcohol acts by facilitating inhibitory synapses. Slide 13. Anxiolytic drugs or tranquilizers help people relax. The most common examples are benzodiazepines, including diazepam or Valium, and alprazolam, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, also known as Xanax. Benzodiazepines are also used to relieve anxiety and promote sleep. Like alcohol, anxiolytics act by facilitating inhibitory synapses. Narcotics are drugs that produce drowsiness, insensitivity to pain, and decrease responsiveness. Opiates are either natural drugs derived from the opium poppy or synthetic drugs with a chemical structure resembling natural opiates. Opiate drugs such as morphine, heroin, methadone, and codeine bind to specific receptors in the brain. The immediate effect of opiates is pleasure and relief from pain. Slide 14. Marijuana is difficult to classify. It softens pain but not as powerfully as opiates. It produces an illusion that time is passing more slowly than usual, but marijuana's effects do not include the more extreme sensory distortions that LSD causes. It has a calming effect, but not like those of alcohol or tranquilizers. Marijuana has several potential medical uses. It reduces nausea, suppresses tumors, reduces pressure in the eyes, and decreases cell loss in the brain after a stroke. However, because of legal restrictions, research of these medical uses has been limited. Marijuana's active compound, THC, acts on abundant receptors. Marijuana acts on receptors on the presynaptic neuron, putting the brakes on release of both excitatory and inhibitory transmitters. Hallucinogens induce sensory distortions. LSD attaches mainly to one kind of serotonin receptor. It stimulates those receptors at irregular times and prevents neurotransmitters from stimulating them at the normal times. One result is a decrease in communication among brain areas, such that sensory and emotional experience occur without the usual guidance and restraint that the frontal cortex would provide. MDMA produces stimulant effects at low doses and hallucinogen effects at higher doses. Many young adults use MDMA at parties to increase their energy. However, as the drug wears off, people feel depressed and lethargic. MDMA also increases body temperature, sometimes to dangerous levels. Several studies have reported persisting depression, anxiety, and memory loss in heavy users of MDMA. Another risk is that MDMA can produce liver damage. Slide 15. Rohypnol and GHB have attracted attention as date rape drugs. Both relax the body, impair muscle coordination and memory, and induce drowsiness. Slide 16. Okay, so we're done talking about the building block of the nervous system, which is the neurons, their synapses, the neurotransmitters that pass between neurons through the synapses, and the exogenous drugs that we could take in that affect these neurotransmitters on the synapses of the neurons. Let's move on to the nervous system structure itself. Slide 17. You use all of your brain, not some small percentage of it. And although most people take for granted that their mind is separate from the brain, the evidence points to the contrary. Mind activity and brain activity are the same thing. To lose part of one is to lose part of the other. This makes psychological research on the brain in the category of monists. That means that they view consciousness as inseparable from the physical brain. Slide 18. Remember earlier when we admitted that the brain kind of looks like a walnut? Or I asserted, and you listened, making you complicit in my book. Regardless, that wrinkly, walnut-looking brain of ours, in all vertebrates, has three major divisions: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. In fish, amphibians, reptiles, and birds, the midbrain constitutes a large portion of the brain. In mammals, including humans, the forebrain is by far the largest area. It consists of hemispheres, the left and right halves of the forebrain. The outer covering of the forebrain is known as the cerebral cortex, and it's especially prominent in humans. Now you know why we're going to spend so much time talking about the cortex. It's apparently one of the things that makes us human and separates us from other vertebrates. Slide 19. Researchers describe the cerebral cortex as consisting of 4 lobes: occipital, parietal, temporal, and frontal, as shown in figure 3.15. The occipital lobe, at the rear of the head, is specialized for vision. People with damage in this area have cortical blindness. People with cortical blindness experience blind sight, the ability to point to or otherwise indicate the direction to a visual stimulus without any conscious perception of seeing anything at all. Some can correctly state an object's color, direction of movement, or approximate shape, again, insisting that they are just guessing. Some respond to the emotional expression of a face that they do not see consciously. Moving on. The temporal lobe of each hemisphere, located toward the left and right sides of the head, is the main area for hearing and certain aspects of vision. People with damage in the auditory parts of the temporal lobe are impaired in recognizing sequences of sounds, such as music or speech. The temporal cortex is also important for feeling something with your fingers and detecting the rate of vibration. Hearing is, of course, also a perception of the rate of vibration, because it is a perception of sound waves in the air. Language comprehension depends on part of the temporal lobe, in most cases, the left temporal lobe. People with damage in that area have trouble understanding speech and remembering the names of objects. Their own speech, grammatical but lacking most nouns, is hard to understand. In other parts of the temporal lobe, damage produces visual deficits. One area of the temporal lobe, called the fusiform gyrus, responds mainly to the sight of faces. People with damage to that area no longer recognize faces, although they see well in other regards and recognize people by their voices. They can describe facial features, such as this is a person with a rounded face, short brown hair, and so forth, but they don't easily recognize the individual. People with damage to another part of the temporal lobe become motion blind. Although they see the size, shape, and color of objects, they do not track speed or direction of movement. They eventually notice that someone who used to be one place is now in another, and therefore must have moved. But they don't see the movement moment by moment. Crossing a street is hazardous because the cars seem stationary. Other parts of the temporal lobe are critical for certain aspects of emotion. The amygdala, a structure in the temporal lobe, responds strongly to emotional situations. People with damage to the amygdala are slow to process emotional information, such as facial expressions and descriptions of emotional situations. The parietal lobe, just forward of the occipital lobe, is specialized for body senses, including touch, pain, temperature, and awareness of the location of body parts in space. The primary somatosensory cortex, a strip in the anterior portion of the parietal lobe, has cells sensitive to touch in various body areas. Parietal lobe damage interferes with spatial attention. People with such damage see what an object is, but not where it is. They have trouble reaching toward it, walking around it, or shifting attention from one object to another. Moving on, the frontal lobe is at the anterior or forward pole of the brain. It includes the primary motor cortex, important for controlling fine movements, such as moving a finger or wiggling a toe. Each area of the primary motor cortex controls a different part of the body, and larger areas are devoted to the areas we control with precision, such as the tongue or the fingers. The anterior sections of the frontal lobe, called the prefrontal cortex, are important for memory of what has just happened and what you are planning to do next. The prefrontal cortex is also critical for directing attention. The prefrontal cortex also participates heavily in decision-making. People with impairments to the prefrontal cortex often make impulsive decisions because they have trouble imagining how good they might feel after one outcome and how sad or guilty they might feel after another. Slide 20. Modern technology enables researchers to develop images showing the structure and activity of various brain areas in living, waking people. Such methods are powerful, but the results should be interpreted with caution. This slide shows a bunch of different ways to measure brain activity. The two that I would focus on are the EEG and the fMRI. Slide 21. The central nervous system, consisting of the brain and the spinal cord, communicates with the rest of the body by the peripheral nervous system, consisting of nerves connecting the spinal cord to the rest of the body. Within the peripheral nervous system, we distinguish the somatic nervous system, which connects to the skin and the muscles, and the autonomic nervous system, which connects to the heart, stomach, and other organs. Sensory nerves bring information from other body areas to the spinal cord, and motor nerves take information from the spinal cord to the muscles, where they can cause contractions. Slide 22. Here's a different way to break down the nervous system. Slide 23. Information from the cerebral cortex passes to the medulla and then into the spinal cord. The medulla and spinal cord receive sensory information from the periphery and send output to the muscles and glands. The spinal cord also controls many reflexes. A reflex is a rapid, automatic response to a stimulus, such as unconscious adjustments to your legs while you are walking, or quickly jerking your hand away from something hot. The cerebellum, part of the hindbrain, is important for any behavior that requires aim or timing, judging which of two visual stimuli is moving faster, and judging whether one musical tempo is faster or slower than another. It is also essential for learned responses that require precise timing, such as quickly responding to a warning signal. Slide 24. The autonomic nervous system controls the body's organs, preparing them for emergency activities or for relaxed activities. The autonomic nervous system has two parts. There's the sympathetic nervous system, controlled by a chain of cells lying just outside the spinal cord, increasing heart rate, breathing rate, sweating, and other processes that are important for vigorous fight or flight activities. It inhibits both digestion and sexual arousal, both of which can wait until the emergency is over. Second, there's the parasympathetic nervous system, controlled by cells at the top and bottom levels of the spinal cord. They decrease heart rate, increase digestive activities, and in general, promote vegetative activities that take place during rest and relaxation. The endocrine system consists of organs that release hormones into the blood. A hormone is a chemical released by glands and conveyed by the blood to alter activity in various organs. Slide 25. When we talk about brain anatomy, it's easy to get the impression that the structures are fixed. In fact, brain structure shows considerable plasticity, that is, change as a result of experience. Early researchers believed that the nervous system produced no new neurons after early infancy. Later researchers found that undifferentiated cells called stem cells developed into new neurons in certain brain areas and not others. Although formation of new neurons is limited, new experiences stimulate axons and dendrites to expand and withdraw their branches. These changes, which occur more rapidly in young people but continue throughout life, enable the brain to adapt to changing circumstances. Slide 26. Biological mechanisms of social behavior have received increasing attention. This is part of what's called social neuroscience. The hormone oxytocin enhances love and trust toward people that you already regard highly. Slide 27. Theoretically, it's a problem to understand how one area of the brain responsible for vision, another responsible for hearing, and yet another responsible for touch combine forces to yield a unified perception of an object. Binding different senses into one experience requires perceiving the various aspects as occurring in the same place at the same time. This problem is called the binding problem. It's the question of how separate brain areas combine to produce a unified perception of a single object. Slide 28. We are 2/3 done with this lecture. Let's move on to genetic principles. Slide 29. Except for your red blood cells, all of your cells contain a nucleus that includes strands of hereditary material called chromosomes. Each human nucleus has 23 pairs of chromosomes, except that egg and sperm cells have 23 single unpaired chromosomes. At fertilization, the 23 chromosomes from the egg combine with 23 of the sperm cell to form 23 pairs for the new person. Sections along each chromosome, known as genes, control the chemical reactions that direct development. To explain the concept of genes, educators often use an example such as eye color. If you have either one of two genes for brown eyes, you will have brown eyes because the brown eye gene is dominant. That is, a single copy of the gene is sufficient to produce this effect. The gene for blue eyes is recessive. Its effects appear only if the dominant gene is completely absent. You have blue eyes only if you have two genes for blue eyes. Slide 30. Because chromosomes come in pairs, one half from the mother, the other half from the father, you have two of almost all genes. The exceptions are those on the chromosomes that determine whether you developed as a male or as a female. Genes on the X or Y chromosome are sex-linked. An X-linked recessive gene will show its effect more frequently in males than in females. For example, red-green color deficiency depends on an X-linked recessive gene. A man with that gene on his X chromosome will have red-green deficiency because he has no other X chromosome. A woman with that gene probably has a gene for normal color vision on her other X chromosome. Consequently, far more men than women have red-green deficiency. A sex-limited gene is present in both sexes, but it affects one more than the other. For example, both men and women have the genes for facial hair, but men's hormones activate those genes. Slide 31. To talk about the gene for something is convenient at times, but it's also misleading. Each gene affects many outcomes, not just eye color, height, or whatever else we happen to have measured. Furthermore, the nature of a gene is more complicated than we once thought. In some cases, part of one gene overlaps part of another gene, or parts of a gene are located in different places. The newly emerging field of epigenetics deals with changes in gene expression without modification of the DNA sequence. Every cell in your body has the same genes, but the genes active in one cell differ from those active in another. And even within a given cell, a gene can be more active at one time and less at another. For an obvious example, puberty turns on certain genes that had been less active before puberty. How does an experience modify genetic activity? Proteins called histones wrap the DNA of a chromosome into little balls. When certain chemicals, called acetyl groups, attach to the histone, they loosen the ball and increase the expression of genes in that ball. Other chemicals, called methyl groups, can attach to the gene and inactivate it. In short, an experience affects you at once and also alters the way you react to a future event. Slide 32. All behavior depends on both heredity and environment, but variations might depend more on the variation in genes or variations in the environment. Suppose we want to estimate how much of the variation in some behavior depends on differences in genes. The answer is summarized by the term heritability, an estimate of the variance within a population that is due to heredity. Heritability ranges from 1, indicating that heredity controls all the variance, to 0, indicating that it controls none of the variance. To estimate the heritability of a behavior, researchers have traditionally relied on evidence from twins. Monozygotic twins develop from a single fertilized egg or zygote, and therefore have identical genes. Most people call them identical twins, but that term is misleading. Some monozygotic twins are mirror images, one right-handed and the other left-handed. It is also possible for various genes to be activated in one twin and suppressed in the other. Dizygotic twins develop from 2 eggs and share only half their genes. They are often called fraternal twins because they are only as closely related as brother and sister. Another kind of evidence for heritability comes from studies of adopted children. Resemblance to their adopting parents implies an environmental influence, whereas resemblance to their biological parents implies a genetic influence. Now that biologists have mapped the human genome, the set of all genes on our chromosomes, it is possible to examine the chromosomes and identify genes that are linked to a particular condition. Slide 33. Based on studies of twins and adopted children, researchers have found at least moderate heritability for almost every behavior they've examined, including loneliness, neuroticism, time spent watching television, yeah, that's a weird one, right? And religious devoutness. About the only behavior for which researchers have reported 0 heritability is choice of religious denomination. Slide 34. Genes that increase the probability of survival and reproduction become more common in the next generation. Some aspects of human behavior make no sense except in the context of evolution. For example, consider the goosebumps you get when you're cold. What good do they do? None. However, other mammals with hairier skin gain an advantage by erecting their hairs when they're cold. Their raised hairs provide extra insulation. Also, consider a human infant's grasp reflex. An infant's hand tightly grasps anything placed into the palm, such as a finger or a pencil. This behavior serves no function today, but for our ancient ancestors, it helped an infant hold on to their mother as she traveled. It is important to distinguish between the most convincing evolutionary explanations, such as for goosebumps and infant grasp reflex, and the mere speculative interpretations. In many cases, it's easy to propose an evolutionary explanation, but much more difficult to test it. Slide 35. And here's where we put to bed some myths about the brain being the center of the central nervous system. First, that we only use 10% of our brain, and second, that some people are left brain while others are right brained. And by extension, what does being left or right brained mean for the percentage of brain we use? Since left brain people are using half of their brain, does this mean that if we're using 10% of our brain, that they're only using 5% of their brain? That doesn't make sense. It's because the answer is no. Neither claim is true. Let's take a look. Take a moment and think about all the things your body is doing that you are just not a part of consciously. Blinking, secreting tears to keep your eyes lubricated, your heartbeat, breathing, digestion, secreting saliva to keep your mouth lubricated. The list goes on and on and on. Something must be keeping all of these functions in equilibrium if we're not doing it consciously. That something is the other 90% of the brain that people are trying to convince you isn't being used. That is, we use almost all of our brain almost all of the time, both sides. That's right. While there are areas of the brain that are responsible for specialized processing, both sides of the brain are in constant communication with each other. So while the left or right side of the brain might be better at certain mental activities, they're only relatively better at those activities. Brain tissue is expensive from an evolutionary perspective, and it's highly implausible that natural selection would favor such a wasteful device that only has 10% efficiency, or is only using 50% capacity. Further, brain imaging studies show that the majority of the brain is involved in the most simple of tasks. Again, both sides. These two misconceptions are likely the result of misunderstanding or claims made by researchers. For instance, William James did mention at one point that he thought people were only reaching 10% of their intellectual potential. And in the preface of a popular book, he was misquoted as saying we only use 10% of our brain. Also, there is research done on split brain patients that demonstrate specialization of each hemisphere. But these robust results don't cross over to those of us who aren't split brain patients. Regardless, these are enough to cement a wrong idea in the mind of the general public for quite some time. Slide 36. This wraps up Chapter 3, Biological Psychology. In this lecture, we covered the nervous system cells, the nervous system structure, and some genetic principles that apply to human biology. See you next chapter.